Hello and welcome once again to The Blueprints. This is Canada's Conservative Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Schmale, Member of Parliament for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock, with new content for you every single Tuesday, 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We ask that you like, subscribe, comment, share this program. Help us push back against that ever-moving Liberal agenda. And of course, as always, if you can't watch or listen to the entire program right this second, you can download it later on, maybe on platforms like CastBox, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, you name it. It is out there, and together we can give people within your social media network a narrative that is different from what they might be hearing on the mainstream media. So with that, we give you new content. It is the first week back in Parliament after the most important election in Canadian history, says Justin Trudeau. $610 million just to achieve pretty much the same result. And he waits 2 minutes to reconvene Parliament. The British Parliament comes back within days of a federal election, not us apparently. So to talk about this and much more, because we have inside Ottawa stuff that we need to get through. Also, we want to really touch on what's happening in British Columbia as well. So we're bringing in Richard Bragdon. He's the Member of Parliament from Tobique, Mactaquac. We also have John Brassard, the Member of Parliament for Barrie-Innisfil. So John is the Shadow Minister for Ethics and Accountable Government, and of course Richard is the Deputy for that same portfolio. We welcome you both.
Thanks,
Jamie.
Good
to be here. Thanks.
Good to be here.
When we have two of you in person.
It's good.
Yes,
great.
we actually just met this morning on the ethics file, so
it's even better.
So it's fresh in our minds.
All right, let's talk about the first week in Parliament. We're coming back November 22nd. We meet. Everyone's in the chamber, all 338 MPs. But then we get notice that the government will be putting a motion on the table to go back to hybrid Parliament. What is going on? Is it about stopping the spread? Because yesterday on the floor of the chamber, it did not look like they were worried at all, they being the Liberals.
Richard, you want to tackle this one, or I mean, we can both. I'll start.
You go ahead.
Listen, it's absolutely ridiculous the fact that they're even considering not having Parliament and our Legislative Assembly gather. It's been shown, and it's been shown over the last couple of days, that we're able to gather safely. Masks are being worn in the House of Commons. Everybody is vaccinated or has a medical exemption if they're able to. Look, we can put 20,000 people in the Scotiabank Arena. We can put 50,000 people in the Rogers Centre. We can put 300 people in an airplane. But we can't have 338 people in the House of Commons. This is nothing more than an attempt to undermine our democracy, to restrict any sort of transparency or accountability by the Liberal government. And it sounds to me, Richard, like the NDP is in their hip pocket on this one.
So it's just about avoiding Parliament, really, because you remember one Liberal in the last Parliament would answer pretty much or ask every question for the Liberals.
Absolutely, Jamie. This is about avoiding accountability. And there's no substitute for the dynamic of in-person meetings, especially in a parliament. And we know there's precedent around the world where legislatures and parliaments are gathering and meeting, and yes, the protocols are being followed and people are being able to, respect the guidelines and make sure that safety is first and foremost, but they are meeting, and they're meeting in person and they're meeting in full. There's no excuse that Canada's parliament cannot be meeting in person and meeting in full.
Well, it's not like we don't have any business to take care of. I mean, we've got an affordability crisis that's happening right across this country. We've got gas, we've got home heating, groceries are increasing. I know housing affordability, attainable housing is a big issue in Central Ontario. So why we wouldn't gather in our legislature, why we wouldn't have the work of committees to be able to act in person is beyond me. And it just, as Richard said, and as I said earlier, it's just a way to avoid accountability and transparency. It diminishes our democracy, it diminishes our democratic institutions, and this is important for people to understand that this is a government that doesn't want to be accountable for anything. He wants to come out at Rideau Hall on the steps and have the same thing happen as what happened in the first 20 months of this pandemic, right? Where all eyes, all attention are on him, and him being Justin Trudeau, and we need to move beyond that. Listen, we're 20 months into this. We need to get back to some sense of normalcy, keeping in mind that there are protocols in place. We're following those protocols. House administration, House staff are doing a great job keeping us safe. There's no reason why this legislature, this House of Commons can't return.
And we were told it was the most important election going into it. There had to be an election despite a potential third wave of COVID. And yet we wait 2 months to sit for the first time. The Trudeau government has yet to announce the parliamentary secretaries, which I think is unheard of this far into it, especially with Parliament sitting. And not only that, as you mentioned, we have the affordability crisis that is going on. There just doesn't seem to be any desire for this government to tackle any issue. And you're right, they want their ministers to sit behind the microphone in front of their computer, and when a question comes from the opposition, they get a little note handed to them that they just read.
Yeah, absolutely, Jamie. I think Canadians are long past the point. They're increasingly frustrated. They want to know that their elected officials are on the job and aware of the challenges they're facing from day to day, whether it's our seniors with the ever-increasing cost of living, whether it's those who are working and they find that the tax burden's getting higher and higher and it costs more just to put groceries on the table and to keep things functioning for their households, or whether it is the person who, or the business owner who cannot find laborers and cannot find people to go to work. These are challenges that are pressing on our people right now, let alone the massive amount of debt that we have accumulated, and that is going to be an extra burden for future generations, not just ours. So we have a great responsibility, and we need to be at the table discussing these things. This is where Parliament is made so that the people's issues can be discussed in open and free debate. The limits around debate and open discussion that's happening right now because of the lack of transparency and the approach that the current Prime Minister is taking is very, very disturbing.
Here's another point I want to raise too, James. When we were at PROC and we were studying this issue, and I was sitting on PROC committee at the time, one of the issues that we talked about was the fact that as long as this Parliament continues to be virtual, then that means that members of Parliament stay in their riding. Okay, that's fine and good, but what are they doing in their riding, right? In the case of the Liberals or even the NDP, I would suggest that many of them are electioneering, right? They're actually not doing their job. This is the seat of power. This is where the Constitution says the Legislative Assembly needs to be, and this is where we need to be. We can't have Liberal members or NDP members, because it was a concern at PROC, in their ridings working their way towards the next election, right? Conservatives are ready to work. I know that the Bloc Québécois, in my discussions with them over the last couple of days, are ready to work here in Ottawa, but it appears that the NDP and the Liberals are not willing to work. And this was a concern that was brought up at PROC, and I suspect that if you check the social media feeds of many of the NDP or Liberal members, if this was in fact to happen, many of them would be at the Rotary Club luncheons. They'd be meeting with constituents in their ridings when they should be here in Ottawa, in the seat of power, in the place where the legislation is passed, and it's a big concern, and it's something that we had some foresight on at PROC, and I suspect that it's going to hold true if this does happen.
And we all voluntarily signed our name on the dotted line saying that we understood the role of the job and the responsibilities and where it would be. So it's not as if an election happened after COVID or before COVID, right? This was during COVID. We all knew what the responsibilities were.
Exactly.
So let's move on. We got a couple of other issues I want to quickly touch on because that was very Ottawa-centered. But let's talk about the PCR test. Let's talk about the border. Canada-U.S. border is starting to reopen, albeit slowly, still requiring the PCR test of Canadians coming back over 72 hours, which is a costly test. We're still waiting on word from Americans because the tourism and hospitality sector are hurt badly. They're on their knees right now, and this is a problem because the federal government doesn't want to listen to those in the industry that are raising legitimate concerns about the PCR test. Every other country, the United States, Europe, is using a different kind of test, which is cheaper, just as effective, but more accessible.
Absolutely, Jamie. And I think that there's not science behind this decision. What's happening is again, they are behind the eight ball on this. Other countries have moved ahead. Things are happening. We can ensure the safety of Canadians through the fact that those who are traveling are going to be vaccinated and they're coming back. Why not explore the options as it relates to better testing that doesn't cost Canadians extra money for travel and be prohibitive for those who want to come to Canada for tourism purposes or visit our country or family members. I have a large border riding, and there are people with family members just across the border that they haven't been able to hardly see, grandchildren and others they want to be able to spend time with and over the Christmas break, etc. And obviously everyone wants things to be done safely and done properly, but there's means to testing that doesn't take near as long nor is near as costly for average Canadians or travelers who are coming. So let's look at the best practices internationally, find out what is working and what can be done, and get that expedited and changed.
It's still having a devastating effect on the travel industry.
Absolutely.
I meet with travel advisors regularly. And they are telling me that people who had trips booked are now not booking them because of the requirement of the PCR test. Everybody who's booking those trips, presumably, and they're telling me, are double vaccinated. So the redundancy of the test, and it's not based on science and evidence, as Richard said. Every decision that's been made, it seems, at the border has been a political one, or a decision that aligns with the liberal ideology, right? And that's a challenge for people right now. I'll give you an example. I had a baseball team in my riding who went down to Maryland. There was a bunch of them. The parents had prepaid for a PCR test. I think it was a couple of $100. The company said they didn't have enough staff to do them, so then they had to make arrangements for another company to do the test. They got to the border. The test results weren't back yet, but the border agent said to them, that's okay, just go over there and do a test. And they did. They didn't even get their PCR test back. So the inconsistency that's happening in the messaging and what's going on in British Columbia right now, as sad and tragic as that has been, there are many people in the border towns of Surrey, for example, or southern BC, who are crossing over the border right now. They've been told by Minister Blair that they don't require a PCR test, so they've gone over. There's been an exemption because that 72-hour period doesn't kick in until November 30th. They've gone over to put gas in their car to get groceries because of the shortages that are existing in southern BC, and they're coming back with no PCR test, and some of them have been fined. Many of them have been fined $5,700 and told to quarantine. So, another example of a big announcement by the government with very little in the way of implementation. So the PCR test, I actually wrote a letter in advance of everybody else writing a letter because of the ridiculousness of this test and the requirement of it. I wrote a letter to the Prime Minister on October 26th, I think it was, and there were subsequent letters, including our leader Aaron O'Toole, that said just scrap the test. People are double vaccinated. There are other ways that we can do this other than restricting people on that test. The other problem that the travel advisors are telling us, people are fearful of false positives when they travel to other countries to get that test. Will I be stuck in that country? For how long? At what cost? And so, if people are double vaccinated, and presumably that is one of the tools in the toolbox to help us get through this, then they need to scrap this test and not burden Canadians with further costs. And many of the border towns, of which Richard is one, border communities, all of the mayors have been asking for this test to be scrapped. So I'm glad to see that the 72-hour requirement is no longer going to be accepted on November 30th, but we need to move to a point right now where there's no more PCR tests and other technology can be used.
Oh, absolutely. And I think your point exactly, both of you, when you're making it, when you're talking about accountable government, the slow pace in which they make decisions. Remember when this whole thing started, way back when, we were asking questions about, are we planning to close the border? What modifications are we making? And we were called every name in the book. I remember Matt Genereux at the time was our health critic. He's from Edmonton. He asked a ton of questions, and the Liberals just shut us down. And then we got hit in the first wave, and the other countries were making arrangements at their airports and their borders, and we were just kind of left looking at what are we doing, and nobody had any idea.
It's amazing how rapid and how much of a massive priority engineering an election was, but yet handling and dealing with this situation that's before us and the prioritizing and making the right decisions to get beyond and get to the other side and get Canada's economy up and roaring doesn't seem to be near the priority for this government. So I think our focus, and that's what we're calling on the government to do, is make sure we're back in this House doing the job and making sure that the priorities of Canadians are being discussed at the table. This is way beyond the point of photo ops and announcements. We have got to get to the place where we are bringing in meaningful policies and meaningful action to kickstart the Canadian economy and get Canadians back to work.
No sector has been impacted more than our travel and tourism sector, and it continues to be impacted as long as we have the restrictions or requirements of these type of tests. Even Americans aren't coming up to the country unless they have to conduct business, and it's a requirement for them to come up here. But I've talked to the travel and tourism sector. All of us have.
Yes.
We've been on multiple calls with hospitality, hotels, travel, tourism, travel advisors. There has to be some certainty in the industry, and there is none of that happening right now, and it's concerning. Listen, our recovery is going to depend on businesses in every sector, in every region, in every part of this country. And we need government, and this is why it's important for us to be in the House of Commons. We need us as legislators, as policymakers, to be able to make the decisions that put those businesses in the best position to succeed economically coming out of this crisis. And my fear is that we're not going to have that opportunity because the government is not interested in us working together.
And a hybrid parliament just puts power back into the executive branch, taking away from the legislature, which I think,
rule by regulation, rule by order in council, not rule by consensus or at least legislation. Right?
Absolutely. So I went a bit long, but we do need to wrap up. I always give the guests, as you know, the last word. Just a few final thoughts. We are thinking about the people of British Columbia quite often, and we will be pressing the government to bring in some policies to help the people in British Columbia. But if you two want to take the final word.
There's an emergency debate request on the situation in BC. Our colleague Mark Strahl, as you know, has stayed back in Chilliwack. It's been a hard-hit community, but all of us have watched the devastation that's gone on in BC, and we're certainly thinking about our fellow Canadians out there. It's a tough situation, but we'll get through it. We're Canadian. We always do.
Absolutely.
And a special thank you to all those who are responding and stepping up in this time, the first responders and others who are right there on the scene working tirelessly to make sure that the needs of our fellow Canadians are being met in British Columbia. So, our thoughts and prayers are certainly with them and their families, and it's time for our government to make sure we're at the table and doing what we need to do to get our country moving forward.
Do you want us back to talk about ethics one time? We'll do that.
There's
no shortage of content there, I can tell you.
Absolutely.
Thanks,
thank you very much, John Brassard, Member of Parliament for Barrie-Innisfil, also the Shadow Minister for Ethics and Accountable Government. Richard Bragdon, Member of Parliament for Tobique, Mactaquac, also the Deputy Shadow Minister for Ethics and Accountable Government. We appreciate both of you coming on the show. It's nice to have a panel. Nice to see people again. It is really nice.
I was just going to the washroom when you called me and asked me if you wanted me to do this. So
serves you right for wandering the halls. Thank you very much for joining us again. Please like, comment, subscribe, share this program. Help us push back against that ever-moving liberal agenda. There might be someone in your social media network that might be open to hearing this message. Please help us. And of course, if you can, listen or watch it right now. Download it on platforms like CastBox, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, you name it. It is out there. New content every single Tuesday, 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Today is Throne Speech Day. We'll have analysis on that next week. If you don't hear it from before, our leader Aaron O'Toole will be having his response. Please check that out. And as always, low taxes, less government, more freedom. That's the blueprint.